The world's various military forces are good at a lot of things, but tidying up after themselves generally isn't among them. The world is littered with abandoned former military stations, equipment, and other objects, so you never know when you might stumble across a military find when you're out walking away from the beaten track. From full-sized command posts to curious pieces of forgotten technology, we know the stories of many abandoned military objects, and we're excited to share them with you in this video. Some abandoned military sites remain top secret, even after the military no longer has a use for them, so it takes a brave urban explorer to go looking for them. Sometimes those intrepid explorers strike gold, as we can see here in these pictures of an abandoned site somewhere in Russia. It contains the remnants and relics of the Soviet space program. The explorer responsible for the discovery didn't want to give the specific location, so all we know is that these old capsules spend their days in an inconspicuous-looking hangar somewhere in the Russian countryside. Most of the vehicles were designed for unmanned spaceflight, but some of them would have contained cosmonauts. Their external surfaces are badly scorched, bearing the scars of atmospheric re-entry. Capsules like this were designed for a single use, so once they were retrieved, they were taken to this hangar and then abandoned. One of them has been identified as a Soyuz capsule from the Progress spacecraft. There isn't much room inside, so those return journeys from space must have been very cramped, hot, and sweaty. We can't help but feel that at least some of this gear would be better off in museums. During the most paranoia-heavy years of the Cold War, the USA built a top-secret military base under the Greenland ice sheet. It would probably have remained a secret forever, but in recent years, parts of Camp Century have been revealed as the ice sheet melts thanks to climate change. The camp was built in 1959 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers under the pretense of carrying out polar research. Inside the frozen tunnels, an operation known as Project Iceworm was built. The plan was to store hundreds, perhaps thousands, of ballistic missiles in Greenland that could be launched towards the Soviet Union at the touch of a button. But the military eventually had a change of heart about the idea several years into the plan. Camp Century was officially abandoned in 1967, and the Army figured that the ice would entomb it and keep it hidden from view forever. They were wrong. The thawing ice might even pose a pollution risk, as it may release the multitudes of waste, diesel fuel, and perhaps even radiological waste from the old nuclear generator into the environment. Such an event is likely to cause tension between the USA and the Greenland government, which isn't thought to have been aware of the true purpose of the base at the time it was created. The abandoned resort of Prora on Germany's Rügen Island offers us an insight into what vacations might have looked like for everybody if Hitler had won the war. The creation of the resort was Hitler's idea, as he believed that every German national should go on one beach vacation per year. In fact, he was fairly insistent about the idea that people should go on one whether they wanted to or not, with a particular emphasis on Nazi soldiers and their families taking mandated breaks. The enormous, sprawling site was commissioned during the 1930s and was well on its way to being completed when the Second World War broke out, forcing him to redirect the funding that had been earmarked to finish the job. Around 10,000 rooms had been finished by that point, which were later used to provide care for the elderly in the post-war years. That lasted until the end of the 1990s, by which time the facilities were showing their age and were considered unfit for purpose. The latest plan for the site is to turn it into a modern holiday apartments. This time, nobody will be forced to stay in them. While we're talking about Hitler's building projects, here's his Olympic Village in Wustemark on the outskirts of Berlin. We take the creation of so-called Olympic villages for granted today, but this one, built for the Olympic Games of 1936, was the first of its kind. Hitler wanted to show Germany's technical and architectural strength off to the world, and this is how he did it. The country has gone to such lengths to distance itself from the Nazis since the end of the war that many modern residents of Berlin don't even know this place exists, even though it's on their doorstep. The site is badly battered and decayed today, but its dormitories, swimming pools, communal dining areas, and training facilities would have been considered state-of-the-art in the 1930s. The 4,000 athletes who stayed here for the tournament would never have been so well provided for. Aesthetically, the village was styled after the appearance of a traditional rural town. The dictator loved the finished product and named it the Village of Peace. Even then, though, he tried to ban Jewish and non-white athletes from using it. The village was eventually seized by the Soviet Army at the end of the Second World War and used as a barracks until 1994, since which it's been abandoned. Baker Island, a tiny atoll in the Pacific Ocean almost exactly halfway between Hawaii and Australia, is a very strange place to visit. It's uninhabited and so flat that there aren't even any trees growing on it. It's a great place to come see endangered forms of marine wildlife, but you'd feel very alone and cut off from the world for as long as you were there. It wasn't always like this. The island was claimed by the USA under the Guano Islands Act of 1856 and briefly colonized it in 1935, resulting in the creation of a lighthouse and a very small town called Mayerton. When the Second World War broke out, the U.S. Army arrived and built a 5,500-foot airfield to be used as a staging base for bombers on their way to Mili Atoll. That happened in 1943 and necessitated the evacuation of all the island's residents. It turned out to be a waste because the airfield closed just 1 year later. Today, the airfield is totally overgrown with foliage, and the lighthouse is a crumbling ruin. Aside from an annual visit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, humans have never returned to Mayerton. Unlike some former military installations, everybody is welcome to visit Teufelsberg in Germany. There's just the small matter of climbing all the way up to the 240-foot-high artificial hill known as Devil's Mountain to reach it. The mountain was built from the rubble that littered the streets of Berlin after the end of the Second World War, and atop it was this NSA listening post. It's said that there's a Nazi-era military college inside the hill, although it was probably destroyed during the construction process. The USA will never confirm this, but most people believe the listening station was part of an American communications monitoring network called Echelon. It would have been used to keep an eye, or more accurately, an ear, on happenings in communist East Berlin during the Cold War. Ingeniously, whoever operated the listening post also built an enormous Ferris wheel under the guise of it being an attraction at the yearly German-American festival. In reality, it was there to improve the station's relay signal. The station probably remained in use until the reunification of Germany in 1990. The south coast of England was a dangerous place to live during the Second World War, because it came in for night after night of assaults from German bombers flying overhead. Government feared that things might get even worse if a full-scale German invasion came by sea across the English Channel, so they built the Monsell Army Sea Forts to put the Germans off the idea. The forts were built in a hurry and became fully operational in 1942. Forming part of the Thames Estuary Defense Network. They didn't see much action during the war, although that means they probably served their purpose as a deterrent. 20 years after the war ended, they were briefly occupied by young people who fancied themselves as pirate radio broadcasters, reaching people in the south of England and the north of France. The government eventually chased the pirate DJs away, and now they've been completely empty for more than 3 decades. The military no longer protects the forts, so there's nothing to stop people visiting them, but they're in a very dilapidated state, and entering them probably isn't wise on account of the fact that they might fall to pieces while you're inside them. We're back on the topic of disused Soviet military facilities now. Let's go to Croatia, which is home to Zeljava Air Base. Back in the days when this was still an active site, it was known by the less descriptive name Object 505. It's positioned right on the border between Croatia and Bosnia, and its existence was such a guarded secret that only a handful of high-ranking army officers and senior politicians even knew it was there. Keeping it secret can't have been easy, because this is one of the largest underground airports in Europe. Aside from serving as a strategic command center, it also hosted an early warning system designed to detect the approach of missiles from long range. The USSR spent 8 years between 1957 and 1965 building their facility at a total cost that exceeded $50 billion in modern terms if we adjust for inflation. The cavernous space boasted enough room to station 2 whole hunter squadrons, with 4 exits for fighter jets. In the event of a nuclear attack, it could be hermetically sealed to protect whoever was inside it. The base was eventually, not to mention reluctantly, destroyed on purpose to prevent it from falling into the hands of one of the many factions involved in the Yugoslavian Civil War. Life isn't easy on Adak Island, which is one of the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, USA. It's very cold, and the wind is very strong. The Aleut people have called it home since time immemorial, but people who settle there from elsewhere don't tend to enjoy it. That's why it was so unpopular with the almost 6,000 U.S. military personnel who were stationed here during the Second World War after the U.S. built an airfield and an accompanying base on it in 1942. From here, flight operations were launched against the Japanese. Common complaints included the weather, the lack of fresh food, and the constant rumblings and smoke emissions from the island's volcano. Even after the war, the U.S. continued to use the Adak Naval Air Station, maintaining a military presence on the island until 1997. When they finally packed up and went home, the island's population dropped from 7,000 to around 300. That's why so many of the old buildings are abandoned today, including whole streets of houses that have collapsed in on themselves after years of neglect. The Elsinore Naval and Military School in Lake Elsinore, California, USA doesn't look much like your average military facility. That's because it was never designed to be one. When work began on the buildings in the 1920s, it was supposed to be the Southern California Athletic and Country Club. The financial woes brought about by the Great Depression ensured that the club never opened, even though building work was completed, so a new owner was needed urgently. In 1933, that new owner showed up in the shape of the Elsinore Naval Academy. Even then, it was never particularly popular or successful. It averaged around 200 new students per year, which was barely enough to pay the bills. In 1977, the school succumbed to the inevitable and closed its doors for the last time. It's now been empty for more than 40 years. Some of the outbuildings burned down because of arson attacks during the 1980s, so since then there's been a caretaker living in an RV on the grounds. That suggests that someone still owns the buildings and wants them to be looked after, but there's no sign of anything being done with them. You'll rarely find a collection of abandoned military bunkers in more scenic a location than Vieques in Puerto Rico. Vieques is a tiny island, so when the U.S. Army turned up during World War II to build these bunkers, they outnumbered the general population easily. While this might sound like a strange place to build a bunker, Vieques became strategically important during the war. The U.S. thought that fortifying it was so important that it was financially worthwhile to buy 2/3 of the land in 1941 to build their bunkers, mostly using them as ammunition stores, snugly into the contours of the hills that the entrances to them are invisible when seen from above. Controversially, the U.S. stayed on the island after the war ended and used it to conduct weapons testing, a practice that the natives abhorred and protested against, eventually forcing the army off the island in 2003. When they left, they abandoned not only their bunkers, but also an unknown number of exploded bombs that still pose a risk to the lives of the residents today. The U.S. National Fish and Wildlife Service has recently volunteered to clean up the mess the Army left behind. The fort of Graca in Alvas, Portugal, is notable for its distinctive star shape. Once upon a time, it was a key fortification tasked with the defense of Portugal. Nowadays, the only thing it's trying to protect is itself from the hazards of erosion and weathering, and we're sad to say it's slowly losing that battle. Fort Graca has stood since 1763 and is a product of its time, consisting of 3 different layers, each separated by a ditch that would once have contained a moat. Right at the heart of the star is the governor's house, which housed the facility's commanding officer. In both form and function, it's a little like the Red Keep in Game of Thrones. The Fort of Graca was demilitarized several years ago, but remained in the hands of the Portuguese Ministry of Defense, who didn't see the point in spending any money on it and so left it to crumble. More recently, both UNESCO and the World Monuments Fund have identified it as a historical site worthy of conservation, so it might now get enough funding to carry out the repair and preservation work that it so desperately needs. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!